Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I think if you're ready, we can get started. I'll be talking about a new way of doing parallel testing using the browser pooling method, and it uses BiDi. So just a quick introduction. I think most of you know me from this morning, but I work at BrowserStack, and I'm at the intersection of open source and developer advocacy, and also been working with Selenium, contributing code and everything else for a while now. I think, yeah, I wrote my first code in 6th standard with a programming language called Logo, where we had to draw shapes. I don't know how many of you use Logo, but that's where my interest peaked, and I think I've been sticking around it for a very long time now. Now that you know a little bit about me, let's pretty much get started with the interesting parts of the session. So just a quick glance over the agenda. We'll be going over the private browsing modes to understand what they are and what they offer in the browser. Then we kind of have a look at the challenges in testing in parallel. And we move on to then covering the WebDriver concepts like user context, which make it possible to use a single browser to do parallel testing. And then we kind of just stitch it all together to see it in action via demos, because I think that's where the fun part lies. No one would want to listen to me yap on for a very long time. And then we just close with some benefits of browser pooling. I will try and keep some time for questions at the end, but I know we're running late, so let's see how that goes. Or otherwise, you can always find me in the hallway, and I'll be open to answering any questions that you have. So yeah, what is a private browsing mode? As usual, I got this definition from Wikipedia. In this mode, browser initiates a temporary session that's totally separate from its main session and the user data, and I think this definition sums it up pretty well. So every time you're in private browsing mode, you get a totally separate, isolated session which has no history whatsoever. It's like a blank slate. And it's a separate session from your main session. So there is no shared data, no history there. And it's like, imagine writing on a whiteboard in a room. You write something, you leave the room, you delete it, there's no trace. So once you close the browsing mode, or private browsing mode, you have no trace of whatever you have done. Yeah, your IP providers know it, but that's about it. And that's what a private browsing mode is. And a quick Google search will show you that they're everywhere. So all browsers supported, all mobile browsers supported, and while they may have a little different names and underlying implementations, but it's supported by all major browsers. Apple has it, and then Google calls it the incognito mode. Edge has it as in private mode. Mozilla has it private browsing mode, and also a little bit of containers, but that's how they do it internally. And yeah, so I think they might have a variety of names, but they serve the same purpose, where you're talking about session privacy and having that data isolated from the rest of it. So you can browse. Yeah, you get like session privacy when you do that. But while we talk about it from a browsing standpoint, I think we're seeing about it's more a privacy-focused matter. But in automation, it's much more than that, and we can. It's amazing how we can use this private browsing mode in automation, and I think I'll talk about it a little bit now. So let's just glance over the kind of data that private browsing mode does not store, and then we can link it to a few use cases which is useful in automation testing, right? So the first thing it doesn't store is any of your past links, any browser history, so it doesn't store that information. Then it doesn't store any form fills. So often when you fill your forms and when you visit again, you'll see your browser would have stored it and you would get some autofill suggestions. When you're testing, you pretty much don't want that. You want to actually go and see how the user would interact with it. And sometimes you don't want the browser to store your inputs from the past. Say one of your tests has, they're doing the happy part testing, so you have certain inputs, and now you want to go ahead and test some error parts. You don't want to use the data that was stored before, right? And that's how it should be. It also doesn't store any of your search history, right? So if you're kind of testing how your website behaves based on users' past searches, what searches results or the experience it would give to the user, that's okay, but you usually don't want that interference when you're doing tests. You pretty much want a clean, isolated slate. So that's what it helps with. It also doesn't save bookmarks. I don't think that is very relevant for testing. It is just what it is. It doesn't store cookies. So cookies have all our session data, all our tracking data, and I think in testing we know how that can interfere with each other. So how often have cookies interfered while testing, right? You want to log in, but there's another test that's logged you out, I mean, that happens. And it does not store any passwords, right? So again, I think login functionality is something that's popularly tested. So every time you're trying to test the login functionality, you don't want your browser to auto-populate the password. You pretty much, when you test, you want to test how a user interacts with it, right? And then how your system then deals with it. So this is what private browsing mode happens, and we've seen how while testing we can not having each of the data stored and how useful that is. So let's talk a little bit about parallel testing. I think parallel testing sounds amazing, does it not? Like, run everything at once, save time, use your resources well, get a faster feedback. But I think it's easier said than done, right? It's pretty much like managing a highway with multiple lanes, where each vehicle needs their own dedicated lane. And if you don't do that, you're in for traffic jams or worse, accidents, I think. So how often have we had tests that have run in parallel and it's not been successful, right? So every time you're orchestrating parallel testing, you have to do it with some thought and design, right? So if you write your tests, they have to be written in isolation in a way that when two tests run in parallel, there's no data leakage, or they're not interfering with each other. And I think another aspect is also when you're running tests in parallel, you're spawning up a lot of browsers. That means then it is using a lot of your resources. It's using a lot of memory, it's using a lot of your CPU, a lot of network bandwidth, and that does add to the total time of how your tests run in parallel. Also, I think one of the biggest concerns is browser startup time is long. So every time you're starting a browser process, it takes a lot of time to start up a browser and then close it. So if you're running, again, multiple ones, that is one place which takes a lot of time, which is consistent across all your tests. So I think these are some of the common challenges. An additional one is also, I think, data collision. So say you're running multiple tests in parallel and your data is stored in one place and your tests are updating, deleting at the same time. You might kind of have to manage how you do that so you have accurate test results. So I think these are some of the common challenges that are there. And let's see how we can then address a little slice of it by running tests in parallel, but just in a single browser with a fresh, clean slate. So WebDriver BiDi, I think that's the new buzzword everyone's talking about. So just a little glance over a simple architecture of BiDi. So WebDriver BiDi is a bidirectional protocol that uses WebSockets to communicate with the drivers and the browsers. So this is how a typical architecture diagram would look, where you have your client, which could be a Selenium or even Appium, someone who's implementing WebDriver BiDi. They create a WebSocket connection with the WebDriver, the driver that knows how to talk to the browser, and it then creates a WebSocket connection to the browser. I think there's a future where you don't need a WebDriver at all and can directly talk to the browser, but that's a totally different matter to discuss at a later point. And yeah, so because it's WebSocket, it's bidirectional, you get a lot more power because it's designed keeping the event-driven nature of browser in mind. So browser have a lot of fun events where you can subscribe to them, and anything of interest happens, you'll get notified back, and then you can use that to your test to your advantage. And WebDriver BiDi is actually an extension of the current WebDriver protocol, also called the WebDriver Classic. So it can do everything WebDriver Classic can do and much more, but with an automation standpoint. So it's designed to be ergonomic and performant in a way that makes sense for test automation, and that's what it is. So let's try to understand how we can make this possible with BiDi, right? So just these are just trying to understand some of the technical terms that I'll be using for my demos later, so you have a good insight of how we can do this, right? So when you start a browser instance, each instance has its own area of storage where they store all the information. So if I've started a single instance of browser, it has its own storage, and any tabs or windows that I open in it will be sharing that storage data. So your session cookies, your passwords, everything will be shared across. So you start a single instance, and say you're browsing a website that's pretty much tracking you. I think each tab and window you open, you see the effect on your user experience when you go do that, right? And that's the same thing. You open another instance. When you open an instance in a private browsing mode, it's a total different browser, which has another isolated storage session. So that doesn't interfere with the earlier browser instance that you had it open. So any tabs or windows that you have opened here, they would be different. So these are two separate user sessions because they're two separate browser instances. So it takes, if you're spawning this up, you're spending double the resources, double the amount of time to spin this up, and then have it in place. But with BiDi, it's a little bit different, right? With BiDi, now I say that we can do this with using a single browser, but there has to be a way to do it, right? So we have a single browser instance, and now we have something called as a user context. So in a single browser instance, you can create something called a single user context. Think of user context as a separate user session having its own storage. Now what you can do is, in this user context, you have the flexibility to decide which tabs or windows sit in it. So tabs or windows are anything that you can navigate. Internally in WebDriver BiDi spec is known as a browsing context, but that's just a technical term. But you can decide which tabs should share this storage, right? So say for one user context, I say I just want a particular window to have the storage layer, and that's it. And say for another tab or a set of tabs, I want another user context, which is totally isolated from this. So now you have a single browser with two tabs or a bunch of tabs that are grouped separately, and they have a separate storage layer. So they're totally isolated from each other. They have a clean slate. So now you can use a single browser to do your parallel testing, because you have two clean slates in one instance at this point of time. And I think this is the most powerful mechanism that we have to actually then go do the testing part of it. So, sorry, I'll just pause here if anyone has any questions, because the next part of the demo lies on how I do this. So as long as this is clear, I'll take a pause for a bit. Any questions, concerns so far? Okay. Everyone's with me? Yeah, so you have separate storage, separate cookies, so you should be okay when you're testing, right? Just one browser instance. Now it's the demo time. So let me show you how we typically do testing. Everyone can see. So, okay. Just for the example, I created a simple website which uses cookies to change the background color. So if you click on the single light blue button, it will change the background to light blue. You click on light green, it will change the background to light green, and you reset it, it's setting it to white. And in the background, it's using cookies to do the same thing. This is just a sample website. And yeah. And has the 3 buttons. And you can kind of see this behavior when you then, yeah, so light blue will change the background to light blue. And when you go then see, sorry about the font, but like, yeah, if you can then go see the cookies, you will see that the cookie is set to that particular color in the background. Yeah, so I've set the theme to light blue, and that's what we have it as. For light green, that's what we have. So you see the behavior of the website is determined by the cookie, and when you reset, the cookie changes. So basically, we have a website where it's dominated by cookies, right? And now when we open the same website in a single instance, in a different tab, you see the cookie sticks. Well, that's what they do, right? Just showing you how that works. And now I open it in a separate browsing instance, which is a private browsing mode. It has no effect of the previous cookies from a separate session altogether, right? So if you go see, there are no default cookies set at all. There is no impact from the previous cookie that we just set. And any changes we make here are isolated from the changes we made at the previous browser instance. And so far, we are kind of using this principle to do our testing, as what I understand in most cases. Okay, so let's move on to the coding part of it. So yeah, I wrote up some tests. I hope people can see, because I know we have a big room. But these are simple tests that use Selenium as we know it today, where we have a WebDriver instance. Everything's in Java, but you can do the same thing in other languages as well. I'm using Firefox, so just setting up some options, enabling BiDi, because we need to do it later. It's not a mandatory step for this part of it. And just pretty much starting the driver with the options. I think most of us have seen this. The code is available in GitHub. There's a link after. So, and I've added a bunch of tests to then see the cookie behavior, where I'm checking if it can change to blue, and then just going through the code to go assert that, okay, this is the background color, that you start with white, you click on a button, it changes to blue. That's what this code base does. Right? So we just have some assertions. We try to visit the same thing again, and then click a button so that the cookie gets set in the background, and then we just check for that. Just checking if it's blue. Now we're also printing out the threads it's running in, and that's the reason for that is just to, when I try to show you if I'm running it sequentially or in parallel, you can see the effect, because if you're running it in parallel in Java, then you see multiple threads running it. If you're running sequentially, it's the same thread. So it's just for demo purposes, that's it. And yeah, it's the same test to do it if you can switch to green. So I have a test that takes one color and then another color. And it pretty much does the same thing at this point. We're just repeating what we've done earlier. And I think the last test that I have is just checking the default color. So if I start with a blank slate, ideally it should be white. So no cookies set, that's the default background that we have. And that's what we're trying to test. And as usual, we clean up after each test. But now we need to remember, I think we need to make note of this, that we're using before each. So before each test, we're starting a browser. So every test is using a separate browser instance. This is how we've been doing things so far, right? I think most of the tests are written in such a manner. And you can see it's running sequentially, it's doing its thing. And the tests pass, because I kind of made them, but they pass. So we're running it in a single thread, they're running sequentially using multiple browsers. And now I run the same thing in parallel, and it should be fine. So we have 3 instances of Firefox, if you can see down, but that was quick. And all of them passed. Yeah. But you can see they run on separate threads because we're running it parallelly. So I think this is how we've been doing it today. But I think the whole goal is to now go see how we can do it better. Or before that, how about we try running this test where cookies impact the session using just single browser. Let's see what happens then. Yeah, sorry, before that I'm trying to, you can do the same thing and add like a private browsing effect to this and it'll still have the same result. So let's just quickly look at that before we move on. Yeah, so it's running in browsing mode and that's okay because again, new instances, it has a fresh session and it should be fine. Sorry. How about when we try to use a single browser instance and use the traditional way of doing things? Let's see what happens then. No, so it's the same test setup. And we are now using a single browser instance. We're using static, so that's just one instance of the driver that we're using throughout the test. So we're not starting up multiple browsers for this particular test. It's the same set of tests. And now let's run them. And they will fail for a very valid reason. Because our entire test is checking the behavior of the cookies, and now we're using a single instance, and the cookies are interfering with each other, right? So when you're trying to do tests using a single instance, each test is kind of taking on from the behavior that is set by a different cookie. So you try to do this today, like today, or the traditional way where we used to do things, it's not going to work, right? It doesn't work for us. Yeah, so the test fails, the assertions don't work out the way we would think we would want them to. So now let's get to the interesting part, where we see how we can now do the same thing, but with BiDi, and how that's possible. So it's pretty much similar setup to what we had before, but the code will be using a lot of BiDi. So when we are now using a single instance of the driver throughout, that means one browser throughout. We're just defining things that we need. We're doing before all, so we'll just initialize the browser once before all of the tests. Just passing in the options like we do. The same setup. So I think this is where it changes a little bit. So this is the part where we now say that before all the tests, I just want to instantiate a single browser. But before every single test, before each test, I wanted to have a separate user context. I wanted to have a separate isolated session, which is a fresh, clean slate, right? So what the code is doing is it's creating a tab, and to each tab, we are kind of assigning a single user context, a new one. So each tab is then within a browser, you have multiple tabs, and each tab has its own session in a way that they don't interfere with each other. That's exactly what the code is trying to do here. Before every test is just a part of the setup that you would do. You can also pretty much enhance it, right? So if you're trying to test a website where you need to, in your setup, before your tests, you need to bring them to a certain stage. You can start them off at a fresh context and then bring them to a certain stage and then do your tests. Yeah, so we are creating, this all present in the GitHub, but this is using BiDi where we are creating a tab. And to each tab, we are just giving that, hey, take a new user context. And yeah. And then we are kind of using it to then navigate and do the rest of our tests. And then we've modified the rest of the test to use the BiDi. This is actually low-level BiDi things. Eventually in Selenium 5, it will be wrapped in the normal APIs that we're using. But for demo purposes, I've used the low-level BiDi APIs that we have. We're pretty much doing the same thing with API, with what we've done previously. We're clicking on a button, trying to get the background, and just asserting, undoing it. Just the APIs are now using the BiDi APIs that we have in place today. We're locating a node, it's finding an element, and then just checking that if the background color has changed just because we've clicked a button. So we're doing exactly what we wanted to do. And yeah, I'm just printing those threads, like I said. Again, we're doing the same thing to switch to green and check for that. Yeah, it's just the same process all over again. We check that we start with white, and then if you're able to then go and switch to green. Yeah. And then we do the same thing again just to check if the background color is white. So it's pretty much the same thing. I think we just close the browser after all the tests are done. So now let's run it, the fun part of it. Yeah. So if you see, we had a single browser. Let me pause a little bit, because I think that went by too fast. Okay, sorry. I'm too slow to pause it for the effect. Okay, let me run this, and then I will pause just to show what happened. Yeah, so you see, it's creating 3 new tabs, right? Each tab has its own user context, and it's doing it in a single browser instance. So it's taken probably half the time to spin up the browsers. Instead of having 3, you have 1 now, and you're able to get the same result that you would when you're testing. Yeah. And we did this sequentially, and you could do the same thing parallelly, and it will still be okay. So like you see, we're doing it in one single thread. I'll show you how we do it parallelly, and you'll see multiple threads doing the same thing, and it should still be okay. Yeah, so now we are running it all in parallel, and yep, it's running on 3 separate threads. So you are now using a single browser, running a test in parallel, and having no problems whatsoever, because you have the isolated state that you need for each of your tests. And I think this is very useful when you're testing a lot of your e-commerce websites, anything with login, anything that is stateful, which a lot of things are these days. So. And you can extend the same thing to the grid. So anyone who uses the grid can also have the same behavior. So the tests pretty much remain the same, but you then point to a grid. And the Selenium grid also supports BiDi, so it should be okay. So I have the same test, but I've just made sure that now instead of pointing to the browser, I'm actually pointing to the grid, who's then doing everything for me. And this is useful when you're using a cloud vendor, right? I think it significantly improves the infrastructure costs on both ends, and versus what you're paying for versus what they have to maintain. So I'm doing the same thing that we've done, but now we're pointing to a grid at this point, like using a remote WebDriver. And yeah, just setting some options that we need. And this is how you use it in Java. You use an augmenter. Rest of it remains the same. And you see here I have a grid. I'm using it in a standalone mode. You can use it in all the modes that we have, and it should still be fine. And we have grid running at a certain port. And now let's run it. So it's the same test again. I've not changed anything. And the results are pretty much, you see the grid UI in the background that it ran something. But again, this was sequential. You can run the same thing parallel with the grid. You can be locally hosting the grid, browser vendor, or you can have your own servers. However you're doing it, doesn't really matter. The result would be the same. So I think what would change is how you use user context, but rest of your setup would be the same. And even in parallel, it did all okay. And I think if we closely observe, even like the time you spend is less because you're not starting up browsers. That's the most expensive operation that we have. Yeah, so I think that was the end of the part where I show the demo that we can do this. And so this is just showing you the language support that we have for user context today. Like I said earlier in my keynote, I think with Java, JavaScript, we're keeping in tab with the browser. So you see these are the BiDi APIs that are there. And I'd like to use Firefox nightly as just a benchmark of what's implemented because they try to stay on top of things. With Java and JavaScript and even .NET, I think we're up to date. It's present today. You can try it after this, and you should be able to do this right away. Ruby, we have some pull requests in progress. And Python, we have some pull requests, but in the other part of BiDi. So we should be able to get to this soon. But if anyone's interested for contributions, more than happy to have them, because we have some references in other languages that you can kind of take from and get started with us. The resources that I used to make this talk possible. So the WebDriver BiDi issue that talks about the user context in detail, the thought process which kind of gave birth to this, the module that made it possible, the module, and the GitHub link. So what I've done is I've put this same code in our examples repo on Selenium, so you can go see how it works and try it out or play around with it if you like. Yeah, I'll just let everyone. Okay. And yeah, just concluding to see the benefits of having a single browser, I think it's always better to consume less and share better. I think that's always the case. So with a single browser using less memory, that's always a good thing. Using less CPU, so less processing power, again, on your machine, so you can do more things now when you're running tests. Execution times, like I said, the amount of startup time it takes for a browser, that's usually the longest and relatively a constant period when you're doing automated testing. So you're saving a lot of time when you're just spinning a single instance, and then you can have at it. And infrastructure costs, like I said, if you're doing it, if you're maintaining your infrastructure or like renting something from the vendors, it saves all the money, right? So you're paying less because you need less resources. They have less to maintain, better footprint everywhere in general as it is. Yeah, and thank you. And in case you have any questions. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention. If you want to hang out, talk to me, have more discussions, at BrowStack we're building a Discord community. We hang out there often to talk all things testing that troubles you. It's not BrowStack specific, it's just named like that. We can scan the QR code if you feel like joining us, and yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Puja. Time for Q&A. Benjamin? Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So a question. Since this is potentially very useful, I think, for the Selenium Grid hosted like Kubernetes version, because that would mean instead of one node in one pod, increasing the amount of sessions that you can run in one pod, right?
Yes.
Do you have any indication of how much it could scale, like considering, for example, Chrome browser in one pod, how many contexts you could have, and like based on resources?
That's a valid question. I don't think I have an answer to how many contexts can one browser support. I think there are things we need to still run some experiments to see how much a browser can handle when you're doing with tabs, because again, there's a little constraint that comes with that. But I wish I had a definitive answer. I'm sorry, I don't.
Thank you anyway.
That was very interesting. Thank you. I was wondering if a website itself opens tabs or new windows, are they still in the same user context?
Yes. So, and you have the flexibility to kind of change that. So if you open, if your tests are opening new websites or tabs, you can also assign user context to them, so then you can make sure that they're all in one box. So say when you're testing, you want, say, your website opens 2 tabs and you want to see how all of them would behave in one box, and you can put them in a single user context. Okay. You get the flexibility to pick and choose and design your tests accordingly.
All right, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for the presentation. I had a question about the timing of test suite, how it is in the percents approximately. If we take a huge test suite and compare with user context and without, what is the decreased time of execution approximately?
So I think you need to, again, that's a good question, but you need to think in terms of how many tests were you running in parallel. So right, so say if you're running 4 instances and now you're running 1 browser instance, it's almost 1/4 of the time in browser startup time, but then you're spending a lot more time doing the tests. So, but at least in what I have observed, maximum time goes in starting up a browser process. That's usually the longest part of it, and then it then depends on how extensive or heavy your test suite is. Right?
Do we have production metrics?
I have not tried anything yet. I'm just working to get this implemented and settled up. I've not tried anything.
Thank you.
Thank you. From what I saw, you combined the classic WebDriver with the WebDriver BiDi in this case. And I was wondering, when you click, how does it know which user contact to do that click in, for example?
So,
how to get that element?
Yeah, and that's a valid question. So every time we open a tab or a window, we then assign a user context to it. And then we use the browsing context of the tab or window to then navigate. So, right, so you have your tab or window, it has associated user context, they're glued together. And then you say, for this context, let's navigate to this website and let's go click it. Right, so that's how you do it. I can explain more after this and show you in the code to do it, because there are a lot of technical terms that I was avoiding to make it easier for everyone. But
all right, thank you.
Yeah.
I've got a question before we go back. Can you help me understand the relationship between user context and profiles, browser profiles?
And I think that's a wonderful question. So the way browser profiles work in a browser are very different internally. They are pretty much like directories and they save a lot of user data. User contexts do seem similar, but internal implementation of browser is totally different. But when you're looking at it from an automation testing standpoint, I don't think there is a lot of difference.
Controversial one.
Yeah.
Aren't you destroying your own business model with this? Because now I have to pay for only one test session and use that 100 times in parallel?
No. You can run more tests and do more cool things with it in shorter time. And I think when you save time and that's more productivity for everyone, I think that's a win for everybody. Because then we might figure out a way to charge you in some other way. Because with all the time we save, so we'll be okay.
Speaking as another browser vendor from a highly commoditized market, this is a very low low margin business that if we could pack more parallel threads and give the user more value, they will always come to us and buy yet more if we're giving them value.
Yep.
Hi, thank you. How many tabs can we open at once? Have you checked?
I have not checked, but I think that would depend on the browser, how much they would have handled. But yeah. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Puja.